January 12, 1945. Lieutenant Frank Novak stood in frozen silence watching his 3rd Sherman burn that week, not from superior German firepower, not from tactical failure, but because someone in Washington decided olive drab green looked good on snow. 6 tanks gone, 10 men dead, all visible from a mile away, like targets at a shooting range. That night, Novak made a decision that would court-martial him or save an army. He would steal from the enemy, repaint American steel white, and make 15 Shermans vanish into winter itself. Ardennes Forest, Belgium, January 3 to 12, 1945. The morning of January 3, 1945, dawned gray and bitter over the Ardennes forest, where snow lay 3 feet deep and the temperature hadn't risen above 15 degrees Fahrenheit in 2 weeks. Lieutenant Frank Novak, 26 years old, commander of 3rd Platoon. Baker Company, 3rd Armored Division, climbed from his Sherman tank and surveyed what the Army called Sector 7, what his men called the meat grinder. Before him stretched a valley of white, interrupted only by skeletal trees and the blackened husks of American armor. 4 Shermans from Dog Company, 3 from Able, all destroyed in the past 72 hours. All painted regulation olive drab green, a color that made perfect sense in the bocage hedgerows of Normandy in the forests of France, anywhere except here, where it stood out against snow like ink on paper. Novak wasn't supposed to be here. 6 months earlier, he'd been a senior at Ohio State University, 3 credits shy of a mechanical engineering degree, designing suspension systems for industrial equipment. Then came the draft officer candidate school and a fast track to the European theater because the Army needed tank commanders who understood machinery. What they didn't tell him was that understanding machinery meant understanding how to keep men alive inside steel coffins painted the wrong color. Lieutenant Sergeant Eddie Kowalski approached his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. 3rd Platoon's ready for patrol, but the men are asking. He hesitated. Asking what? Asking why we're still painted green when every German panzer out there is white as a ghost. Novak had no answer that didn't sound like excuse-making for people who'd never seen combat. The official line from Division Camouflage Paint wasn't in the supply chain. Winter operations hadn't been anticipated. Make do with what you have. Standard military logic that worked beautifully on paper and got people killed in reality. Tell them we do our job, Novak said. Mount up in 10. But Kowalski didn't move. Lieutenant, permission to speak freely. Granted. They're scared, not of fighting, of being seen. Yesterday, Peterson's tank got hit from 800 yards. German gunners spotted them against the snow, had all day to line up the shot. Peterson never even saw where it came from. He's got 3rd-degree burns over half his body now, sir. And we're painted the exact same color. The words hung between them, crystallizing like frost. Novak had done the math. In the past 9 days, Baker Company had lost 7 Shermans in Sector 7. Not from close-range ambushes. Not from superior German armor in stand-up fights. From long-range shots by panzers and anti-tank guns, whose crews spotted them first, aimed carefully, and fired at leisure, while American tanks crawled through snow, visible as parade floats. The German tanks, by contrast, were coated in temporary white paint, Schneetarnung winter camouflage, that let them blend into the landscape until they were close enough to kill. It wasn't sophisticated technology. It was common sense applied to winter warfare lessons learned on the Eastern Front, where visibility meant survival. I know they're scared, Novak said quietly. So am I. But right now we have orders. We patrol the valley, we watch for enemy movement, and we come back alive. That's the mission. 3 hours later, they rolled out 5 Shermans in staggered formation, grinding through snow that reached their lower hulls. Novak rode in the command tank, studying the tree line through his binoculars, searching for the telltale shape of German armor. The problem was, he never saw it until too late. At 11:47 a.m., the world exploded. The first shell struck Sergeant Chen's tank, the No. 3 Sherman dead center on the turret. The impact sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil the size of a house. Flame erupted from the hatches. Novak watched 3 men bail out, rolling in the snow to extinguish themselves. 2 didn't move. Chen didn't emerge at all. "Where'd it come from?" Novak shouted into the radio. 11 o'clock ridgeline, someone screamed. "I see Jesus Christ, there's 3 of them." Novak swung his glasses left. There, 700 yards away, 3 white shapes he'd mistaken for snowdrifts were moving. Panzer IVs, their long 75mm guns trained on the valley. They'd been there the whole time, invisible until they fired. All tanks reverse smoke and reverse. But smoke grenades meant for concealment in summer forests did nothing against winter white. The second German shot hit Lieutenant Morrison's tank, penetrating the front glacis plate and detonating the ammunition inside. The Sherman came apart like a tin can in a firecracker. No one got out. Novak's crew made it to cover a small rise that blocked the German line of sight, but 2 more tanks didn't. When they counted heads afterward, 5 men dead, 7 wounded, 3 tanks burning. All because they'd been spotted first. That night, back at the company assembly area, a cleared sector behind Allied lines where Baker Company maintained their remaining vehicles, Novak sat in the maintenance tent with his platoon sergeant and calculated loss rates. The numbers were damning. Since December 16th, when the offensive started, Baker Company has suffered 40% casualties in Sector 7. Novak said, his voice flat with exhaustion. Division average is 18%. The difference isn't German skill or better equipment, it's visibility. We're getting spotted 3 to 5 seconds earlier than units operating in forests. That's enough time for a trained gunner to aim and fire. Kowalski set down his coffee. "You calculated this." "I was an engineer. Calculating is what I do." Novak pulled out a battered notebook where he'd been logging every engagement range visibility conditions, time to first shot. "Look at the pattern. Every tank we've lost in open snow was hit from beyond 500-yard sniper range for tank combat. That doesn't happen in forests or towns. Only here where we stand out like targets on a range. So what do? We change color." Kowalski laughed a bitter, exhausted sound. "Great plan, Lieutenant. You want to requisition white paint through supply. Because I tried that last week. Know what they told me? Not available. Use standard camouflage techniques. Like draping tree branches on a tank somehow makes it invisible in a snowfield." Novak didn't respond. His mind was already moving ahead, sketching possibilities, calculating angles. This wasn't a tactical problem, it was an engineering problem. And every engineering problem had a solution if you were willing to challenge assumptions. The next morning, January 10th, he went to see Captain Raymond Walsh, Baker Company's commanding officer. Walsh was a career officer, 42 years old. West Point graduate, a man who believed in chain of command and proper procedure. He listened to Novak's presentation, the casualty figures, the visibility analysis, the comparative effectiveness of camouflage without interruption. When Novak finished, Walsh leaned back in his field chair. "Your analysis is sound, Lieutenant. I agree we have a visibility problem. But the solution isn't in our hands. Division has no white paint in inventory. It's not part of the logistical chain. Supply Command says the earliest they could source appropriate materials would be late February, possibly March. Sir, with respect, we might not have a company left by March." Walsh's expression hardened. "I understand your frustration. But we follow procedure. I've forwarded your report up the chain. That's all we can do." "Captain, permission to speak candidly." "Granted." "Procedure is killing us. We're fighting a winter war with summer tactics because someone decided not to plan for snow. If we wait for the system to fix itself, we're writing death letters to parents whose sons died because their tanks were the wrong color." The tent was silent, except for the distant rumble of artillery. Walsh's jaw tightened. "You think I don't know that? You think I sleep well knowing I'm sending men out to die for lack of goddamn paint? But I'm not a dictator, Lieutenant. I'm an officer in the United States Army. We have rules. We follow orders. We trust the system works. And when the system fails, Walsh stood signaling the conversation was over. Then we adapt within authorized parameters. Dismissed. Novak saluted and left. But outside the command tent, standing in ankle-deep snow, watching mechanics work on damaged Shermans, he made a decision that would haunt or define him. If the system wouldn't save his men, he would go outside the system. That evening, he gathered his most trusted soldiers, Sergeant Kowalski Corporal James Murphy, a former Detroit factory worker who knew welding and mechanics, and Private First Class David Rosen, a New York kid with a talent for scrounging supplies. "Gentlemen," Novak said quietly, "I need volunteers for something that might get us court-martialed." The three men exchanged glances. Murphy spoke first. "Does it involve white paint?" "It involves acquiring white paint through unauthorized channels." "You mean stealing," Rosen said. "I mean appropriating enemy supplies for tactical necessity." Kowalski grinned. "When do we leave?" Novak spread a map on the hood of his Jeep. Intelligence reported a captured German supply depot 15 miles northeast here, overrun 3 days ago by the 82nd Airborne. It's under guard but hasn't been fully inventoried. If the Germans stored winter camouflage paint there, it might still be sitting in crates. "And if we get caught," Murphy asked, "then I take full responsibility. I'll put it in writing you were following orders." "With respect, sir," Kowalski said, "that's bullshit. We're volunteers. We do this together." The others nodded. Novak felt something tighten in his chest. Gratitude mixed with guilt. These men were willing to risk their careers, possibly their freedom, because they trusted him. He couldn't fail them. "We leave at 0200 hours, he said. 2 trucks, 8 men total. In and out before dawn. If we're lucky, we'll have enough paint for the whole platoon by morning." That night, Novak sat in his tank and wrote a letter he hoped he'd never have to send. It began, "If you're reading this, I've been arrested for theft of military property. I want it known that I acted alone against orders to save the lives of my men." He sealed it, addressed it to his parents in Ohio, and tucked it inside his jacket. Then he loaded his sidearm, checked his watch, and went to steal from the Germans, not to defeat them, but to learn from them. Because sometimes survival meant breaking every rule you'd been taught to follow. And in war, the difference between hero and criminal was often just a matter of who lived to tell the story. The convoy rolled out at 02:17 hours on January 13th. 2 deuce-and-a-half trucks, headlights off, grinding through ice that cracked under their wheels like brittle bones. Novak rode in the lead cab with Kowalski driving Murphy beside him, checking a hastily drawn map by the glow of a shielded flashlight. Behind them, 6 more men huddled under canvas tarps, their breath forming clouds in the cargo bed. Nobody spoke. Speaking made it real, made it theft instead of tactical necessity, made them criminals instead of soldiers doing what needed doing. Novak's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not from cold, from the weight of what he'd set in motion. In his jacket pocket, folded tight, was the confession he'd written. If they got caught, he'd hand it over immediately. Court-martial. Dishonorable discharge. Prison, maybe. But his men would walk free. That's what he told himself. That's what let him give the order to move. 3 miles out, Murphy whispered. Should see the depot soon. The road bent through forest, stripped bare by artillery. Moonlight caught on shell craters filled with ice. Somewhere in the distance, a mortar barked, American or German, impossible to tell. The front line was fluid here, a gray zone where maps lied, and luck mattered more than tactics. Kowalski slowed the truck. "Movement. 2 o'clock. Novak grabbed his binoculars. A Jeep, American markings parked on the shoulder. 2 figures standing beside it, smoking. Military police armbands visible even at this distance. "Shit," Murphy breathed. "They're patrolling the supply route." Novak's mind raced through options. Turn back, admit defeat. Watch more men die tomorrow. Push forward. Risk immediate arrest before they even reach the depot. Or the third option, The engineer's solution changed the variables. "Pull over," he said. "Sir, do it. Nice and slow." Kowalski eased the truck to a stop 50 yards from the MPs. Novak climbed out, straightened his jacket, and walked toward them with his hands visible, not threatening, not surrendering, just an officer checking on a late-night patrol. The senior MP was a staff sergeant, maybe 35, with the weathered face of a man who'd seen too many winters in uniform. His partner was younger, probably fresh from the States, still carrying himself like the rules mattered out here. "Evening, Lieutenant," the sergeant said. His tone wasn't hostile, just tired. "Kind of late for a supply run." "Kind of late for a patrol," Novak replied. "Orders are orders." The sergeant took a drag from his cigarette. "Where you headed?" This was the moment. Lie and risk getting caught in it later. Tell the truth and bet everything on a stranger's humanity. Novak chose truth. "The captured German depot. 15 clicks northeast." The young MP stiffened. "Sir, that facility is restricted. Only authorized personnel with proper documentation." "I don't have documentation," Novak said quietly. The sergeant's eyes narrowed. "Then you need to turn around." "I need paint." "Paint. White paint. Winter camouflage. The kind the Germans use to keep their tanks from getting blown to pieces in snow." Novak's voice stayed level, but something in it must have carried weight because the sergeant didn't interrupt. "I've lost 6 tanks in 10 days, 53 men killed or wounded, not because we're bad soldiers, because we're visible. Because someone in supply command decided white paint wasn't worth shipping, and now my boys are dying for that decision." The young MP opened his mouth. The sergeant raised a hand silencing him. "So you're stealing it," the sergeant said. "I'm appropriating enemy supplies for immediate tactical use." "That's stealing with extra words, Lieutenant." "Yes, it is." The two men stared at each other. Around them the forest creaked with cold. Murphy had climbed down from the truck, his hand resting casually near his sidearm, not threatening, just present. The sergeant glanced at the trucks at the men inside them, then back at Novak. "How many you got in your platoon?" 15 tanks, 63 men." 63. The sergeant dropped his cigarette grounded under his boot. "You know what happens if I report this?" "Court-martial. Dishonorable discharge. My men go home early, just not the way they wanted. And if I don't report it, then maybe 63 men make it through this winter." The silence stretched. The young MP looked between them confused, waiting for someone to enforce the regulations he'd memorized in training. But the sergeant just stared at Novak with the expression of a man calculating odds on a bad hand. Finally, he pulled out a small notebook, scribbled something, tore out the page, and handed it to Novak. "This says I stopped you at 0230 hours, checked your identification, and cleared you for passage to Forward Supply Depot 79er. If anyone asks, you had verbal authorization from your CO for emergency requisition." Novak stared at the paper. "This is falsified. This is cover, for both of us." The sergeant's voice dropped. "My kid brother drives a Sherman in the 4th Armored. He writes me letters about watching his friends burn because they can't hide in the snow. So here's what's going to happen, Lieutenant. You're going to take your trucks to that depot, you're going to load up whatever paint you can carry, and you're going to be gone before 0500 when the morning patrol comes through. And I'm going to forget I ever saw you." "Why?" "Because someday someone might do the same for my brother." The young MP finally found his voice. "Sergeant, this is against protocol." "Protocol doesn't bury friends," the sergeant snapped. Then softer to Novak. "Get out of here. And Lieutenant, don't come back this way. Next patrol might not be as understanding." Novak saluted. The sergeant returned it. No more words needed. Back in the truck, Kowalski exhaled hard. "Jesus Christ, I thought we were done." "We're not done until we're back with paint," Novak said. "Drive." They reached the depot at 0251 hours. 3 warehouses, prefabricated German construction surrounded by wire fence and guard posts, manned by bored infantrymen, who waved them through when Murphy flashed the MP's note. Nobody questioned 2 American trucks at a captured enemy facility. Everyone assumed someone else had authorized it. Inside the first warehouse, chaos. Crates stacked to the ceiling labeled in German Gothic script. Motor oil, rations, ammunition, medical supplies. Everything the Wehrmacht needed to sustain an offensive, now property of the U.S. Army, and about as organized as a train wreck. "Spread out," Novak ordered. "Look for anything marked Farbe or Anstrich paint. White containers most likely. Move fast." The men scattered. Novak went to the back corner where smaller crates were piled, pulled one open with a pry bar. Tent stakes. Another crate, radio tubes. A third jackpot. 50-pound metal drums, German military markings, white paint splashed on the lid. "Here," he called. "Second warehouse, check for more." They found 37 drums total. Murphy did quick math. About 1,200 pounds, maybe 80 gallons total. Enough for 15 tanks if we're careful. "Then we're careful," Novak said. "Start loading." They worked in silence, adrenaline overriding exhaustion. Kowalski and Rosen rolled drums up a makeshift ramp into the first truck. Murphy and 3 others loaded the second. Every sound felt amplified, metal scraping metal boots on concrete, their own breathing too loud in the cold air. Novak checked his watch. 03:34 hours. They had maybe an hour before the shift change, before someone started asking questions they couldn't answer. "Faster," he urged. That's when headlights swept across the warehouse entrance. Everyone froze. A jeep pulled up, engine idling. Doors opened. Footsteps approaching. "Act natural," Novak whispered. "We belong here." 2 MPs entered, different ones, older, carrying themselves with the authority of men who'd caught 1,000 soldiers doing things they shouldn't. The lead MP, a master sergeant, with 3 stripes and 20 years of skepticism in his eyes, stopped 5 feet from Novak. "Lieutenant, hell of a time for inventory." "Emergency requisition," Novak said, keeping his voice steady. "My CO authorized immediate withdrawal of winter supplies." "Did he now?" The master sergeant walked to the nearest drum, ran his finger across the German markings. "Funny thing about requisitions, they usually come with paperwork. You got paperwork, Lieutenant?" Novak's hand moved to his jacket pocket. Not for the MP's note that wouldn't work twice. For the confession letter. The one that ended his career but cleared his men. But before he could pull it out, Corporal Murphy stepped forward. "My fault, Sergeant. I was supposed to file the forms before we left. Lieutenant told me to, but we were in a hurry and I screwed up." Murphy's voice carried the perfect blend of sheepishness and honesty. "It's all on me." The master sergeant's eyes narrowed. "That's so?" "Yes, Sergeant. I can go back right now, file the proper forms if you want. But we've got a patrol at 0600, and without this paint we're rolling into a kill zone painted bright green. Your call." The lie was beautiful, simple, believable. The kind of administrative screw-up that happened 100 times a day in any army. The master sergeant looked at Murphy, then at the drums, then at Novak. "How many tanks you got, Lieutenant Sin?" 15. 60-70 men. 63. The master sergeant was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Softer. Like he was talking to himself more than them. "I got a nephew in the 2nd Armored. Kid's 19. Writes letters saying he can't sleep because every time he closes his eyes he sees his tank getting hit. Says the Germans spot them before they spot back. Says it's like being a duck in a shooting gallery." He walked to the truck, looked at the loaded drums, then back at Novak. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to finish my patrol, which takes me about 45 minutes. When I come back through this warehouse, better be empty of unauthorized personnel. And, Lieutenant..." He pulled out a small notepad, scribbled something, handed it to Novak. "You find any paperwork issues later, you show them this. Says I personally approved emergency withdrawal of captured enemy materials for frontline tactical use. My signature. My ass on the line, not yours. Novak stared at the paper. Why? Because I've been doing this job for 23 years and I'm tired of filing reports on dead kids who died for stupid reasons. The master sergeant's jaw tightened. Now get the hell out of my depot before I remember I'm supposed to arrest you. They loaded the last drums in 8 minutes flat and rolled out at 0403 hours. Nobody breathed easy until they were 5 miles from the depot, back on the supply route, watching the sky lighten from black to deep blue. Kowalski broke the silence first. We just stole from the U.S. Army. We appropriated, Murphy corrected. With permission, Rosen added. From 3 different MPs who could change their minds any second. Kowalski finished. Novak said nothing. He was thinking about the master sergeant's nephew, about the staff sergeant's brother, about all the other tank crews out there visible and vulnerable, waiting for supply chains to solve problems that were killing them right now. They reached Baker Company's assembly area at 0512 hours, just as reveille sounded. Mechanics were already firing up welding torches, checking fluid levels. Novak jumped from the truck and found his platoon gathered by the maintenance tent, not sleeping, he realized. They'd been waiting. We got it, he said simply. The men erupted. Not cheering, they couldn't risk drawing attention, but something between relief and disbelief. Sergeant Chenface, still bandaged from yesterday's burns, actually smiled. What now, Lieutenant? Someone asked. Novak looked at the drums, at his men, at the 15 Shermans lined up in the pre-dawn darkness, still painted regulation olive drab green. Now we paint, he said, fast and quiet. Before anyone asks permission, we don't have. They worked through breakfast, through the morning briefing, through the normal routines of a company preparing for another day of war. Novak forged a work order, routine maintenance and winterization, and posted it on the duty board. As long as the tanks were combat-ready by noon, nobody would ask questions. The paint went on cold and thick. They used brushes scrounged from the motor pool rags torn from spare uniforms, and in some cases, bare hands because it was faster. The men worked in teams, 1 to paint, 1 to watch for officers, 1 to clean up evidence. They covered every surface hull turret gun barrel, even the treads. By 1100 hours, 13 tanks were done. By 11:45, all 15. Novak stood back and looked at his handiwork. 15 Sherman tanks, once olive drab green, now white as January snow. Imperfect, streaky in places, but from 200 yards away, they melted into the landscape. Captain Walsh appeared at 12:03 hours. Novak snapped to attention, prepared for the explosion. But Walsh just walked along the line of tanks, saying nothing, examining each one with the careful eye of a career officer calculating consequences. Finally, he stopped in front of Novak. Did you have authorization for this, Lieutenant? No, sir. Did you steal that paint? I appropriated it from captured enemy supplies, sir. Walsh's expression didn't change. You know, I could have you arrested right now. Yes, sir. I've prepared a written confession accepting full responsibility. My men were following orders. The hell they were. Walsh's voice was quiet, hard. You think I don't know what you did? You think I don't know? You put your entire career on the line last night. Novak said nothing. Walsh looked at the tanks again. When he spoke, something had shifted in his tone. How many gallons did you get? 80, sir. Enough for the platoon with some reserve. And the MPs who caught you, they let us go, sir. Why? Because they had brothers, nephews, sons. Novak met Walsh's eyes. Because they understood that sometimes saving lives means breaking rules. The silence stretched. Somewhere a radio crackled with coordinates. A truck engine turned over, the machinery of war continuing regardless of one officer's rebellion. Walsh pulled out his notebook, wrote something, tore out the page. This is a backdated authorization for emergency procurement of winter camouflage materials. It's signed by me and predates your little midnight raid by 2 days. As far as any investigation is concerned, you had permission all along." Novak took the paper stunned. "Sir, I'm not doing this for you, Lieutenant. I'm doing it because you're right. We're losing men for lack of goddamn paint, and I'm tired of writing letters to mothers." Walsh's voice dropped. "But understand this, you ever pull a stunt like that again, without telling me first, I will personally see you court-martialed. Clear." "Clear, sir." Walsh turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Tomorrow, you're taking your invisible platoon into Sector 7. And Lieutenant, you better make damn sure this works, because if it doesn't, we both go down for this." That night, while the company slept, Novak sat in his tank and wrote a different letter. Not a confession, a promise. "Dear Mom and Dad," it began. "If you're reading this, something went wrong. But I want you to know I did what I thought was right. Not what was easy, not what was authorized, but what would keep my men alive." He sealed it, addressed it, and filed it with the company clerk for posthumous delivery. Then he checked the paint on his Sherman one last time, running his hand across the rough white surface that might save his life tomorrow, and whispered into the darkness, "Let this work. Please God, let this work." Because in the cold calculus of war audacity, without results, was just another word for failure. And failure painted white or green still meant men burning alive in metal coffins while the snow fell silent around them. Dawn on January 14th arrived gray and bitter temperature holding at 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Novak stood in the assembly area watching his platoon mount up, and for the first time in 10 days, he couldn't find his tanks. They were right there, 15 Shermans lined up in formation, but his eyes kept sliding past them, searching for the familiar olive-drab shapes that weren't there anymore. The white paint worked. Even knowing exactly where to look, he had to concentrate to separate tank from snow steel from ice. Lieutenant Private Rosen stood beside him, voice uncertain. "We really doing this? We're really doing this. What if it doesn't work? What if they still see us?" Novak turned to face him. Rosen was 19 from Brooklyn, a kid who'd lied about his age to enlist, and now wondered if that had been the dumbest decision of his short life. His hands shook not from cold, from fear that had nowhere else to go. "Then we die painted white instead of green," Novak said. "But at least we tried. At least we didn't just accept it. That's supposed to make me feel better. It's supposed to make you angry enough to fight back." The platoon rolled out at 06:42 hours. Same route as yesterday. Same valley, same Sector 7 that had swallowed 3 American companies in 2 weeks. But this time, when they descended into the killing ground, something felt different. Novak watched through his periscope as they advanced across open terrain that should have gotten them killed. 500 yards. 600. 700. No incoming fire. No distant muzzle flashes from concealed German positions. Kowalski's voice crackled on the radio. "Lieutenant, I can barely see you and you're 50 yards ahead. This actually works." "Stay focused," Novak replied. "Just because they can't see us doesn't mean they're not there." But he felt it too. The strange liberation of invisibility, of fighting a war where the enemy couldn't find you first. Every tank commander knew that feeling of exposure, of being visible on a landscape with nowhere to hide. This was the opposite. This was power. At 0817 hours, Murphy spotted movement. "Contact, 10 o'clock ridgeline. Looks like, Jesus, 3 Panzers, same position as yesterday." Novak swung his optics left. There they were, 3 Panzer IVs in white winter camouflage positioned exactly where they'd ambushed the platoon 24 hours ago, waiting for the next convoy of olive-drab targets to roll through their kill zone. "They don't see us," Chen whispered over the radio. "They're just sitting there." Novak did the math. 800 yards. Long range for a Sherman 75mm gun, but manageable if the target wasn't moving. And these targets weren't moving. They were waiting, scanning for enemies they expected to see coming from miles away. "All tanks hold position," Novak ordered. Gunners, lay on your targets. Fire on my command. His heart hammered. This was the moment. Either the invisibility was real, or they'd just driven into a trap. Range 800 yards, Murphy said beside him, voice steady. Target locked. Fire. 5 Sherman guns fired simultaneously. The sound cracked across the valley like thunder. At 800 yards, Novak watched his tracer arc through frozen air and punch into the lead Panzer's turret. The other 4 rounds hit within seconds, 3 strikes, 2 near misses. The lead German tank erupted. Ammunition cooking off turret-lifting men, bailing out into snow that wouldn't save them. The other 2 Panzers pivoted wildly, searching for threats they couldn't locate. One fired blind shell, impacting 200 yards from the nearest Sherman. The second tried to reverse treads, churning snow. Second volley, Novak called. Lead the moving target. This time, all 5 rounds found metal. Both remaining Panzers burning. 11 minutes from first contact to complete destruction. No American casualties. No incoming fire that came close. Novak's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not from fear now. From something else. Something that felt dangerously close to joy. Sir. Murphy's voice was small. Did we just... Yeah, we did. That night, back at the assembly area, the platoon gathered around the burned-out barrel where they kept warm between missions. Nobody spoke at first. They just stared at each other, processing what had happened. Finally, Chen broke the silence. 3 tanks. We killed 3 tanks and they never even saw us. 4 years I've been doing this, Kowalski said. Never had a fight that one-sided. Never. It's the paint, Rosen said. It's just paint, but it's everything. Novak listened to his men talk, watched their faces change as the reality settled in. They'd spent weeks dying for lack of camouflage. Now they had it, and suddenly the war felt different. Winnable. The Germans weren't invincible. They'd just had an advantage that nobody had bothered to counter. Captain Walsh appeared at 21:34 hours. Lieutenant, walk with me. They moved away from the men into darkness between 2 maintenance tents. Walsh pulled out a cigarette, didn't light it, just held it like he was remembering better times when smoking seemed important. Division called, Walsh said. They want to know why Baker Company suddenly has white tanks when nobody else does. Novak's stomach dropped. What did you tell them? I showed them your casualty rates, 40% before, 7% after. Asked them if they wanted to argue with statistics. And... Walsh finally lit the cigarette. And they want you to brief the regimental staff tomorrow at 0900 on your experimental camouflage initiative. That's what they're calling it now. Not theft, not insubordination, an initiative. Sir, I don't understand. You embarrassed them, Lieutenant. You solved a problem they said couldn't be solved using methods they said were impossible. Now they have 2 choices. Court-martial you and admit they were wrong, or promote your solution and pretend they authorized it all along. Walsh exhaled smoke. Guess which one protects more careers? They're going to steal my idea. They're going to save lives with your idea. Isn't that what you wanted? Novak had no answer for that. Walsh was right. The goal had never been recognition or glory, just keeping men alive. There's something else, Walsh continued. Other units heard what happened today. Dog Company asked if they could borrow some paint. Able Company too. By tomorrow, half the division will want white tanks. We only have about 15 gallons left. I know, which is why Division is scrambling to source proper winter camouflage through official channels. Should arrive in 3 to 4 weeks. That's too late. The offensive won't last that long. Walsh dropped his cigarette, ground it under his boot. Which is why units are taking matters into their own hands. I got reports of soldiers mixing lime powder with motor oil, painting their tanks with whatever white substance they can find. Some are using bedsheets. Others are stealing enemy paint just like you did. He looked at Novak. You started something, Lieutenant. A mutiny. A quiet one, but still a mutiny. Men refusing to die for bureaucratic failure. Is that what you're going to tell Division? I'm going to tell them exactly what worked. Proper winter camouflage reduces visibility, reduces casualties, and wins engagements. Everything else is details they don't need to know. The briefing at 0900 hours was everything Novak hated about military bureaucracy. 12 staff officers in a heated tent drinking coffee taking notes while he explained with maps and photographs how invisibility changed combat mathematics. They asked technical questions: coverage area, application, time, durability under fire. Like they were evaluating a product pitch instead of a solution men had died for lack of. Colonel Benjamin Hargrove, regimental commander, listened without expression. When Novak finished, Hargrove leaned back in his chair. Lieutenant, your results are impressive, but I have concerns about discipline. You acquired this paint through irregular channels. I acquired it from captured enemy supplies, sir. Without proper authorization. With respect, sir, I asked for authorization. I was told to wait for the supply chain. While waiting, 6 of my tanks were destroyed. And now, Hargrove continued, we have multiple units engaging in similar unauthorized procurement. Yesterday I got a report that Easy Company broke into a German warehouse and removed 80 gallons of paint. No paperwork, no oversight, just soldiers taking what they wanted. Taking what they needed, Novak corrected. The tent went silent. Junior officers didn't correct colonels, not in briefings, not ever. Novak waited for the explosion. Instead, Hargrove smiled, thin, tired, the smile of a man who'd commanded too many funerals. You're right, Lieutenant. They took what they needed, because we failed to provide it. He stood. Gentlemen, effective immediately, all armored units in this division are authorized to apply winter camouflage using any available materials. If Supply Command can't deliver, white paint commanders will source it locally. Captured enemy supplies are specifically authorized for this purpose. One of the majors cleared his throat. Sir, that's essentially authorizing theft. That's authorizing survival, Hargrove snapped. And if anyone in Supply Command has a problem with it, they're welcome to come up here and explain to these men why looking good on paper is more important than breathing. He turned to Novak. Lieutenant, you're dismissed. And Novak, good work. Walking back to his platoon, Novak felt something strange. Not pride exactly, more like exhaustion mixed with disbelief. He'd broken every rule he'd been taught, risked everything, and somehow ended up commended for it. But the weight didn't lift. Because he knew the truth, he'd gotten lucky. Lucky that the MPs had brothers in tank units. Lucky that Walsh chose to protect him. Lucky that Hargrove valued results over regulations. If any of those variables had changed, he'd be in a stockade right now instead of walking free. That afternoon they rolled out again. Same sector, different mission. Division intelligence reported a German counteroffensive building 15 to 20 panzers supporting infantry, preparing to retake ground lost the previous week. Baker Company, along with Dog and Easy, was tasked with disruption, hit supply lines, create chaos, make the Germans think twice about attacking. At 15:23 hours, Murphy spotted the convoy first. Contact south moving west. Looks like 8 trucks, 2 half-tracks and shit, at least 4 panzers escorting. Novak studied the formation through his optics. Standard German supply column, probably ammunition and fuel headed for forward positions. Under normal circumstances, a single platoon wouldn't engage. Too risky. Too much armor. But these weren't normal circumstances. All tanks combat spread, Novak ordered. We'll hit them from the flank. Panzers first, then the soft targets. On my mark. They positioned along a ridge 800 yards from the German route. 15 white Shermans invisible against snow-covered slopes. The German column approached completely unaware. Novak watched the escort Panzers, Panzer IVs, one Tiger deadly at any range, roll past his position. Waited. Calculated. The Tiger was the threat. Everything else was manageable. Target the Tiger first. 3 tanks fire together. Everyone else engage the Panzer IVs. "Lieutenant," Kowalski said quietly, "if we miss the Tiger, we don't miss." The Tiger was 700 yards out when Novak gave the command. 3 75mm rounds hit within a second of each other. 2 penetrated the side armor where it was thinnest. The Tiger shuddered, stopped smoke pouring from hatches. The other 4 Shermans engaged the Panzer IVs. At this range, with targets moving slow and unaware, it was target practice. 3 Panzers burning within 90 seconds. The 4th tried to pivot return fire but couldn't locate shooters. The German infantry scattered. Truck drivers abandoned vehicles. Total chaos. "Cease fire," Novak ordered. "Withdraw. Fast." They pulled back before German artillery could range them, before reinforcements arrived, before their luck ran out. By the time enemy fire started falling, Baker Company was 2 miles away, vanishing into terrain that welcomed white tanks like ghosts coming home. That evening, Division reported the results. 1 Tiger destroyed 4 Panzer IVs, burning 8 supply trucks, abandoned minimal German ammunition, reaching forward units. Total American casualties 0. Word spread fast. By nightfall, every unit in the division was requesting white paint. By midnight, soldiers were raiding German depots across a 30-mile front, coming back with drums of Schneetarnung, like pirates with treasure. Novak sat in his tank reading a letter from his mother that had finally caught up with him. She asked about Ohio weather, about when he'd be home, about his plans for finishing his engineering degree. Simple things. Peacetime concerns. He couldn't answer any of it. The distance between her world and his felt unbridgeable. Rosen climbed up beside him. "Lieutenant, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "When you stole that paint, when you decided to do it, were you scared?" "Terrified." "But you did it anyway." "Yeah." "Why?" Novak folded the letter, tucked it away. "Because being scared of court-martial is better than being scared of watching you burn to death in a tank I could have saved." Rosen was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Sir, thank you." "For what?" "For caring more about us than your career." After Rosen left, Novak sat alone in the darkness, listening to the distant rumble of artillery, thinking about the strange mathematics of war. How 50 gallons of stolen paint mattered more than 1,000 pages of regulations. How 3 MPs breaking rules had saved more lives than a dozen staff officers following them. Somewhere out there, other tank crews were painting their Shermans white, defying orders they'd never received, solving problems nobody had officially admitted existed. A quiet rebellion spreading through frozen forests, turning tank battalions invisible, 1 stolen drum at a time. The system would catch up eventually. Supply Command would deliver proper camouflage paint, fill out the right forms, restore proper order. But by then, hundreds of men would already be alive who should have died. And that, Novak thought, was worth every rule he'd broken, every risk he'd taken, every sleepless night wondering if this was courage or just desperation wearing a uniform. In the machinery of war, where regulations outweighed reason and procedure trumped survival, small acts of defiance became revolutions. And sometimes the only way to save the system was to refuse to let it kill you. By January 28th, 15 days after Novak's midnight raid, white tanks had become the new reality across the Western Front. Not through official decree, Supply Command was still filing requisition forms for paint that wouldn't arrive until March, but through what military historians would later call spontaneous tactical adaptation. A polite term for mass disobedience that nobody wanted to punish because it was working. Novak's platoon had fought 12 engagements in those 15 days. 12 times rolling into German-held territory. 12 times coming back with all tanks intact. Their casualty rate 3 wounded, none killed. Before the white paint, they'd been losing men every other day. Other units reported similar results. Dog Company casualties down 62%. Easy Company down 58%. Across the entire 3rd Armored Division, losses had dropped by half in sectors where winter camouflage was employed. The statistics were undeniable, the implications terrifying. On February 2nd, Novak received orders to report to SHAEF headquarters in Versailles. Not a request, A direct summons from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the top of the command pyramid where generals planned invasions and decided the fate of armies. "They're going to arrest you," Kowalski said, helping Novak pack his dress uniform. "This is it. They let it slide while it was working, but now they're going to make an example." "Maybe," Novak replied. He'd been expecting this. The army could tolerate tactical innovation, but it couldn't tolerate the implication that frontline lieutenants made better decisions than the supply apparatus. Somebody had to take the fall to preserve institutional dignity. "What are you going to tell them?" "The truth. I stole enemy paint to keep my men alive. If they want to court-martial me for that, at least 63 soldiers will be alive to testify. It was worth it." The trip to Versailles took 18 hours through snow and ice. Novak rode in a staff car with a captain he'd never met, who spent the entire journey reading reports and saying nothing. Professional courtesy or deliberate intimidation, Novak couldn't tell. SHAEF headquarters occupied the Trianon Palace Hotel, a building that had survived one world war and was now managing another. Inside, officers moved with the efficient urgency of people whose decisions echoed across continents. Novak felt small, out of place. A field lieutenant in dress uniform surrounded by men with stars on their shoulders and years of staff college in their bearing. He was shown to a conference room on the 3rd floor. 8 officers already seated. Brigadier General Harold Morrison at the head of the table, flanked by colonels and majors whose nameplates read like a roster of the war's administrative elite. "Lieutenant Novak," Morrison said. "Sit." Novak sat. Morrison opened a folder. "You've had quite a month. Care to explain how a single platoon commander managed to revolutionize winter warfare doctrine across an entire theater?" "Sir, I wouldn't characterize it as—" "I would." Morrison's voice was flat, hard. "In 3 weeks, you've inspired or, depending on perspective, incited hundreds of unauthorized raids on enemy supply depots. You've created a black market for stolen paint. You've undermined the entire procurement system by demonstrating that frontline soldiers can solve their own supply problems without waiting for official channels." Novak said nothing. There was no defense that wouldn't sound like justification. 12 officers are currently under investigation for misappropriation of captured materials," Morrison continued. 4 sergeants face court-martial for breaking into restricted areas, and every single one of them cites you as precedent. Lieutenant Novak did it and got commended, they say. Why are we being punished? "Sir, if I may, you may not." Morrison closed the folder. "You created a crisis, Lieutenant, a crisis of discipline, of command authority, of institutional trust. And now I have to decide what to do about it." The room was silent. Novak felt his career ending in real time. Dishonorable discharge. Prison, maybe. All because he'd refused to watch men die for bureaucratic incompetence. Then Morrison did something unexpected. He smiled. "Which is why," the general said, "I'm promoting you to captain and assigning you to my staff." Novak blinked. "Sir, you heard me. As of today, you're Captain Novak, assigned to SHAEF G4, logistics with a specific mandate, develop formal winter camouflage doctrine for all Allied armored units. You broke the system. Now you're going to fix it properly." "I don't understand." One of the colonels spoke up, a man named Patterson, whose uniform showed ribbons from the North Africa campaign. "We have a problem, Captain. You exposed it. Our procurement system failed to anticipate winter warfare requirements. Our doctrine assumed the war would be over by Christmas. Our paint specifications prioritized standardization over tactical flexibility. You proved all of that wrong using stolen German supplies and midnight raids." "We can't have chaos," Morrison added. "We can't have every lieutenant deciding which regulations to follow. But we also can't ignore results. Your platoon's success rate is statistically significant. Other units copying your methods show similar improvements. The data is clear. Proper winter camouflage saves lives." Patterson pulled out a document. "Here's what's happening. Effective February 15th, all Allied armored vehicles operating in winter conditions will be required to apply temporary white camouflage. Supply Command is sourcing 50,000 gallons of water-soluble white paint for immediate distribution. We're also authorizing field commanders to acquire supplementary materials through local procurement, which is military code for steal it if you have to, but don't tell us the details. You're legalizing what I did, Novak said slowly. We're incorporating what worked, Morrison corrected. Your methods were unacceptable. Your results were undeniable. So we're keeping the results and sanitizing the methods. He leaned forward. But understand this, Captain. You will never speak publicly about stealing that paint. You will never tell journalists or historians about the MPs who let you go. The official story is that you conducted an authorized field trial of experimental camouflage at the direction of your commanding officer. Clear. You're rewriting history. We're protecting the institution while implementing necessary reforms. That's leadership. Novak wanted to argue, wanted to say that erasing the truth dishonored the men who'd risked everything to make this happen. But he also understood the calculus. The Army could either admit catastrophic failure in winter warfare planning, or it could quietly fix the problem while maintaining institutional credibility. What about the men who got caught? He asked. The ones facing court-martial for doing exactly what I did. Morrison glanced at Patterson, who nodded. Charges dropped, all of them. We're issuing a blanket amnesty for unauthorized procurement of winter camouflage materials dated between January 10th and February 10th. After that, everything goes through official channels. And my platoon returns to Baker Company under a new commander. You're needed here developing training materials and implementation guidelines. Morrison stood, signaling the meeting's end. You start Monday. Dismissed. Walking out of SHAEF headquarters, Novak felt hollow. He'd won. His idea was now official doctrine. Thousands of tanks would be painted white, thousands of soldiers would survive because of it. But the victory tasted like ash. They'd taken his rebellion and turned it into policy. Erased the midnight raids, the desperate gambles, the MPs who'd chosen humanity over regulations. Made it clean. Professional. As if proper camouflage had been the plan all along. He returned to Baker Company on February 4th to collect his gear and say goodbye. The men gathered around him, Kowalski, Murphy, Rose, and Chen. All of them looking betrayed. They're pulling you, Kowalski said. We finally have a CO who gives a damn, and they're sending you to push papers in Versailles. It's not like that. It's exactly like that. Murphy's voice was bitter. You fixed their screw-up, and now they're burying you in staff work, so nobody asks how it happened. Novak couldn't argue. Murphy was right. Listen to me, he said quietly. What we did here, what you did, matters. It's going to save lives across the entire front. Maybe the whole war. They can reassign me. They can rewrite the story, but they can't erase the fact that you refused to die quietly. You fought back, and you won. We fought back because you showed us how, Rosen said. No, you fought back because you wanted to live more than you wanted to obey. I just gave you permission. They stood in silence, 15 men who'd survived winter warfare by breaking every rule together. Novak wanted to tell them something meaningful, something that would matter when they rolled into the next battle without him, but words felt inadequate. Finally, Chen spoke. Sir, permission to speak freely. Granted. What you did stealing that paint, it wasn't about the paint. It was about trusting us more than you trusted the system. Nobody does that. Officers talk about leadership, but when it matters, they follow orders and let us die. You didn't, and we won't forget that. Novak's throat tightened. He saluted. They saluted back. No more words needed. That night, driving back to Versailles, he watched white tanks moving through the darkness, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all painted with supplies that shouldn't exist according to official records. A ghost army that had materialized because someone questioned whether visibility mattered more than regulations. His new office at SHAEF was small, windowless, buried in the logistics section where staff captains wrote memoranda about supply chain optimization. His first assignment: draft formal guidelines for winter camouflage application, including coverage area requirements, paint mixture specifications, and maintenance schedules. It was everything he hated about military bureaucracy. Turning lived experience into regulation, making rebellion safe. But as he worked, something unexpected happened. Officers started visiting his office, captains and majors, and occasionally colonels, asking questions that had nothing to do with paint specifications. "How did you know it would work?" one captain asked. "You had no authorization, no testing, nothing. How did you know stealing that paint wasn't just suicide by court-martial?" "I didn't know," Novak admitted. "I calculated odds. 63 men versus my career. The math was easy." "But you could have been wrong." "Then I would have been wrong and court-martialed. But at least I tried." The captain was quiet for a moment. "I have a similar problem. Ammunition supply for my regiment is inadequate. Official channels say 3 weeks minimum to resolve, but we're engaging the enemy in 5 days. What are you asking me?" "I'm asking if it's worth it. Breaking protocol, risking everything." Novak looked at him, really looked. Saw a man caught between duty and conscience, between following orders and saving lives. The same choice Novak had faced in a frozen valley 3 weeks ago. "How many men in your regiment?" Novak asked. 840. "And how many will die if they run out of ammunition in combat?" The captain's jaw tightened. "Too many." "Then you already know the answer." The visits continued. Word spread through SHAFE that the new captain in G4 Logistics understood the gap between regulation and reality. Officers came asking about fuel shortages, medical supplies, winter clothing problems the system acknowledged but couldn't solve fast enough. Novak couldn't authorize their solutions, couldn't give them permission to break rules. But he could listen, could offer technical advice, could suggest that sometimes saving lives mattered more than saving procedure. By mid-February, reports started filtering in. A quartermaster captain who'd found 300 winter coats in a liberated French warehouse, coats that officially didn't exist until paperwork caught up. A transportation officer who'd borrowed trucks from a depot to evacuate wounded ahead of a German counteroffensive. Small rebellions, each one justified by arithmetic that favored lives over regulations. On February 23rd, Morrison called Novak to his office. "Captain, we have a problem." Novak's heart sank. "Sir, your winter camouflage doctrine is too effective. Tank units are requesting white paint for spring operations. They want to keep the tactical advantage even after snow melts." "That defeats the purpose of camouflage, sir. White tanks in green forests are more visible than olive drab." "I know that, you know that, but frontline commanders don't care. They've gotten used to invisibility and don't want to give it up." Morrison sighed. "You created a monster, Captain. Now everyone thinks they can improvise doctrine based on local conditions. Isn't that just tactical flexibility? It's chaos with a friendly name." Morrison pulled out another folder. "Here's your next assignment. Develop seasonal camouflage guidelines. Not just winter. Spring, summer, fall, all of it. Paint specifications for every environment. And Captain, make it foolproof. Because after you, we can't afford another lieutenant deciding regulations don't apply to him." Walking back to his office, Novak understood what had happened. He'd wanted to save his platoon. Instead, he'd accidentally proven that the system was flexible enough to absorb rebellion if the results were good enough. That institutional rigidity could bend without breaking as long as someone was willing to push. It wasn't the revolution he'd imagined, that frozen night stealing German paint with 8 scared soldiers. It was something smaller, more ambiguous. A crack in the facade that let fresh air in without tearing down walls. But as he sat down to write doctrine for seasonal camouflage guidelines that would govern how armies painted tanks for the rest of the war, he thought about the 63 men he'd left behind in Baker Company. About Kowalski and Murphy and Rosen and Chen rolling into combat in white Shermans that official records claimed had been authorized all along. They knew the truth. The MPs who'd let them go knew. The staff sergeant with a nephew in the 2nd Armored knew. Captain Walsh knew. Hundreds of soldiers across the front who'd stolen paint and defied orders to stay alive, they all knew. History would record that Allied forces adopted winter camouflage in February 1945 as part of standard operational doctrine. It would note improved survival rates and tactical effectiveness. It would credit SHAEF leadership with foresight and adaptability. But it wouldn't mention the midnight raids, the falsified paperwork, the quiet network of officers who'd chosen conscience over compliance. And maybe that was fine. Maybe truth didn't need official recognition to matter. Maybe it was enough that men survived who shouldn't have because someone refused to accept that visibility was more important than bureaucracy. The war would end. The paint would wash off. The regulations would be revised and refined until they erased every trace of desperation that had birthed them. But somewhere in Ohio, in Brooklyn, in Detroit, and 1,000 other towns, men would come home who'd been dead by military planning, but alive by military defiance. They'd never tell the full story. Never explain exactly how they'd survived winter in tanks painted with stolen enemy supplies. They'd just shrug and say they got lucky. That the Army finally figured out winter camouflage. That someone smart at headquarters had thought of it just in time. And in the silence between those words, in the things they didn't say, the truth would survive. Passed quietly between veterans who understood that sometimes breaking the system was the only way to keep it from breaking you. The war ended on May 8, 1945, 4 months after Novak stole 40 gallons of paint. By then, winter camouflage had become so routine that nobody questioned its origins anymore. Supply depots stocked it. Training manuals codified it. The innovation that had started with theft and desperation was now just another line item in military doctrine. Novak spent VE Day in his SHAEF office, writing the final section of Technical Manual 92835, Tactical Camouflage Application for Armored Vehicles in Variable Terrain. 300 pages of specifications, diagrams, and procedures that reduced rebellion to regulation. He should have felt proud. Instead, he felt tired. The celebration outside was deafening soldiers, shouting vehicles, honking someone firing a rifle into the air in defiance of every safety protocol. The war was over. They'd won. Millions would go home to lives interrupted, but not destroyed. Novak wondered how many of them owed their survival to paint. He never calculated the final numbers. Nobody did officially. But intelligence estimates suggested that winter camouflage reduced armored casualties by 40 to 60% across units that employed it. If you extrapolated that across the entire Western Front from February to May, accounting for all the tank crews who'd adopted white paint through authorized or unauthorized means. Thousands. Maybe tens of thousands. Men who came home because someone had questioned whether olive drab was worth dying for. But there would be no medal for that. No mention in the history books. Just a technical manual with his name buried in the credits. One captain among dozens who'd contributed to a document that pretended winter camouflage had been planned all along. On June 3rd, Novak received orders to return stateside for demobilization. The Army was shrinking fast, releasing officers whose wartime expertise no longer mattered in peacetime. He'd served his purpose. Now he could go back to Ohio, finish his engineering degree, and pretend the last 18 months had been something other than organized chaos held together by regulations that worked when convenient and were ignored when necessary. His last day at SHAEF, Morrison called him in. "Captain Novak, I wanted to thank you personally before you shipped out." "For what, sir?" "Writing manuals." Morrison's expression didn't change. "For showing us that the system could adapt. That it didn't have to be perfect, just flexible enough to learn from its mistakes. By covering them up and pretending they never happened. By implementing solutions faster than the bureaucracy could stop them." Morrison sat down, gestured for Novak to do the same. "You think I don't know what really happened? You think I believe your midnight raid was authorized? I read the reports. I talked to the MPs. I know exactly what you did." Novak said nothing. "But here's what matters," Morrison continued. "You were right. The system failed, and you fixed it using the only tools available: initiative and theft. Now I could have court-martialed you to defend institutional credibility, or I could have promoted your solution and let the institution claim credit it didn't deserve. I chose the latter because it saved more lives. It was still a lie. It was a necessary fiction. Wars are full of them. Morrison pulled an envelope from his desk drawer. This is for you. Don't open it until you're home. Novak took the envelope, felt something small and metal inside. Sir. Dismissed Captain and Novak. Whatever you do after this, don't stop questioning whether the rules make sense. That's what made you valuable. Don't let peacetime kill it. The ship back to America took 11 days. Novak spent most of it on deck watching the ocean and trying to remember who he'd been before the war. The engineering student who'd cared about suspension coefficients and stress calculations. That person felt like fiction now, someone he'd read about but never actually been. He opened Morrison's envelope on day 7. Inside was a Bronze Star medal and a citation that read, "For meritorious achievement in ground operations against the enemy. Captain Novak's innovative tactical solutions and leadership under fire resulted in significant operational success and preservation of American lives." No mention of paint. No mention of theft. Just the sanitized version that would go in official records and mean nothing to anyone who hadn't been there. He threw the medal overboard, not dramatically, not in anger, just quietly dropped it over the rail and watched it disappear into the Atlantic. Because accepting it felt like accepting the lie that innovation had been encouraged, that the system had worked, that his rebellion had been anything other than desperate men refusing to die for bureaucratic failure. The medal sank. The truth stayed with him. Ohio in July 1945 felt alien. His hometown had survived the war, untouched, same streets, same houses, same people, going about lives that had been paused, not destroyed. His parents welcomed him home with tears and relief, asked careful questions about France and Belgium, avoided asking about the things he couldn't talk about. He enrolled at Ohio State to finish his degree. Sat in classrooms with kids 4 years younger who'd missed the draft by luck or age, who talked about engineering like it was purely theoretical. They calculated load-bearing stress on bridges that would never be built, designed systems that would never fail, lived in a world where regulations were obstacles to work around, not decisions that got people killed. Novak couldn't relate to any of it. One afternoon in September, a classmate named Richard Carter approached him after class. Carter was 22, had spent the war in a factory building aircraft parts, carried himself with the guilty awareness of someone who'd stayed home while others fought. "Frank, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "You were in tanks, right? 3rd Armored?" "Yeah." "My brother was in the 1st. He wrote me letters about winter fighting, about how they couldn't hide in the snow. He said they were losing tanks every day until somebody figured out white paint." Carter's voice was careful, like he was approaching something fragile. "Was that you?" Novak stiffened. "Why do you ask?" "Because Mike came home. He survived the winter, made it through to Germany. Came back with frostbite and shrapnel scars, but alive. And he told me the only reason he's alive is because some lieutenant stole German paint and broke every regulation doing it." Carter's eyes were wet. He didn't know the guy's name, just that it happened in 3rd Armored Baker Company, and it spread from there. A lot of people figured out winter camouflage. Mike said it was one person first, one guy who refused to watch his men die while waiting for permission. Carter's voice dropped. "If that was you, I wanted to say thank you. Because Mike's getting married next month. He's going to have kids. He's going to live a whole life he shouldn't have had. And somebody made that possible." Novak didn't know what to say. The official story was clear. Winter camouflage had been systematic implementation of doctrine, not one lieutenant's midnight theft. Admitting otherwise meant admitting the lie, meant making Carter question every other official narrative he'd been told. But looking at Carter's face, at the gratitude and hope there, Novak couldn't maintain the fiction. "It wasn't just me," he said quietly. It was 8 guys willing to risk court-martial. It was 3 MPs who looked the other way. It was a company commander who falsified paperwork to protect us. It was hundreds of tank crews who saw what we did and copied it without permission. I started it, but I didn't do it alone. But you started it. Because I was too angry to accept that regulations mattered more than lives. Carter was quiet for a moment. Then he extended his hand. My brother's alive because you were angry. Thank you. They shook. Carter left. Novak sat in the empty classroom feeling the weight of something he couldn't name. Not pride exactly. More like responsibility. The knowledge that his decisions had echoed farther than he'd understood, saving people he'd never met, creating futures that shouldn't exist, according to military planning. He graduated in 1947 with a degree in mechanical engineering and took a job at a paint manufacturing company in Cleveland. The irony wasn't lost on him. He spent the next 30 years developing industrial coatings, better adhesion, faster drying, improved durability. Nothing that saved lives, just incremental improvements to products people barely thought about. He married in 1949, had 2 daughters, lived a quiet life in a Cleveland suburb, coached Little League, attended PTA meetings, never talked about the war except in the vaguest terms. His wife knew he'd commanded tanks. His daughters knew he'd been in Europe. Nobody knew about the 40 gallons of stolen paint that had changed how armies fought. In 1963, a military historian named Dr. Raymond Keller contacted him. Keller was writing a comprehensive history of armored warfare in World War II and had found inconsistencies in the official records about winter camouflage adoption. The doctrine says implementation began February 15, 1945. Keller explained over the phone, but I have casualty reports showing improved survival rates in 3rd Armored starting January 15th, a full month earlier, and when I try to find documentation explaining that discrepancy, everything's classified or missing. Maybe the records are just incomplete, Novak said, or maybe something happened that didn't make it into official histories. Keller's voice was careful. I've interviewed 40 veterans from 3rd Armored. 7 of them mentioned a lieutenant who stole German paint. None of them knew his name, but they all remembered Baker Company January 1945. They remembered watching tanks disappear into snow. They remembered feeling safe for the first time that winter. Novak's hands tightened on the phone. Why are you calling me? Because your name appears on the technical manual for winter camouflage doctrine. And because Captain Raymond Walsh, before he died last year, told me I should talk to Frank Novak if I wanted to know what really happened. Walsh, the company commander who'd protected him, who'd falsified authorization to cover the theft, who'd carried that secret for 18 years before passing it to a historian. What do you want to know? Novak asked. The truth. What actually happened in January 1945? So Novak told him. Not the sanitized version. The real story. The midnight raid, the terrified MPs who'd let them go, the decision to break every rule because following them meant writing more death letters. He talked for 2 hours remembering details he'd tried to forget, the weight of the confession letter in his jacket, the sound of stolen paint drums rolling into trucks, the way his hands had shaken painting that first Sherman white. When he finished, Keller was quiet for a long time. This should be in the history books, the historian finally said. It won't be. The official story protects too many careers, justifies too many decisions. Admitting that frontline desperation solved problems headquarters couldn't would raise questions nobody wants asked. But it's the truth. Truth matters less than narrative. The Army needed to believe it had adapted systematically, not that it had been forced to adapt by insubordinate officers. So that's the story that gets told. Keller published his history in 1965. It mentioned winter camouflage in 3rd Armored, but attributed it to innovative field commanders responding to tactical challenges. Novak's name appeared once in a footnote as a contributor to technical doctrine. The midnight raid, the stolen paint, the quiet rebellion, none of it made the final manuscript. Novak wasn't surprised. He'd learned long ago that history preferred clean narratives to messy truth. But in 1978, something unexpected happened. A veteran named James Murphy Corporal Murphy, now a Detroit union organizer, organized a reunion for Baker Company. 37 men showed up, including Kowalski, Chen, and Rosen. They were older now, grayer, carrying the weight of 3 decades in bodies that remembered being young and terrified in frozen Belgian valleys. They met in a Cleveland hotel, drank too much, told stories their families had heard 100 times. But on the second night, Murphy stood and asked everyone to be quiet. "There's something we need to talk about," he said. "Something that's been bothering me for 33 years. The room went silent. We all know what Lieutenant Novak did. We were there. We helped load that paint. We watched him risk everything to keep us alive. And then the Army took that story, sanitized. It turned it into doctrine and pretended it was always the plan." Murphy's voice shook. "I've spent 30 years reading history books that don't mention what actually happened. My kids learn about World War II in school, and nobody tells them about the lieutenant who stole from Germans to save Americans. And I'm tired of it. I'm tired of the truth being classified for bureaucratic convenience." Chen stood. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we tell the story ourselves. Write it down. Get it published. Make sure somebody remembers what really happened before we're all dead, and the sanitized version is all that's left." They talked until 3 in the morning, argued about memory, about loyalty, about whether exposing the Army's lies mattered when the war was 3 decades past. Some argued for silence, that the men they'd been in 1945 had accepted the bargain, had chosen to let the institution claim credit in exchange for avoiding court-martial. Others argued that silence was complicity, that letting the lie stand dishonored everyone who'd been saved by that rebellion. Finally, Novak spoke. "The truth is complicated," he said. "Yes, I stole that paint. Yes, the Army covered it up. But that cover-up is also why winter camouflage got implemented so fast. If they'd court-martialed me, the idea would have died. By claiming it was always authorized, they made it acceptable for other units to adopt it. The lie saved lives." "So we just accept it?" Rosen asked. "No. We remember it. We tell our children and grandchildren. We make sure the truth survives, even if it doesn't make the official histories." Novak looked around the room at faces he'd once commanded, now lined with age, but still carrying traces of the young men they'd been. "The system will never admit it failed. But we don't have to pretend it didn't. We just have to make sure someone remembers what survival actually looked like." They didn't write a book, didn't go public, but they told their families. Passed the story down like inheritance, something valuable that couldn't be taxed or regulated away. And slowly, quietly, the truth spread. Novak died in 1994 at age 75. His obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer mentioned his service in World War II and his career in industrial coatings. Nothing about winter camouflage, nothing about the night he'd changed how armies fought. But at his funeral, men came who hadn't been invited. Veterans from Baker Company, some traveling from across the country. They stood in the back wearing old dress uniforms that barely fit, holding a photograph none of the family recognized. Novak's daughter Jennifer approached them after the service. "What's that picture?" Kowalski, now 82, and walking with a cane, handed it to her. "This is your father's real legacy." The photograph showed 15 Sherman tanks painted white, barely visible against snow. On the back, in faded handwriting, "Baker Company, the Invisible Platoon, January 1945. "I don't understand," Jennifer said. "He never talked about this." "He wouldn't have. The Army made him promise not to." Kowalski's voice was rough with emotion. "But those tanks that paint, that's why 63 men made it home who shouldn't have. That's why I got to meet my wife, raise my kids, live my life. Because your father looked at regulations that were killing us and said, no." The other veterans nodded. Chen stepped forward, tears in his eyes. "We're the last ones left," he said. "Most of the platoon's gone now. But we wanted you to know your father saved us, not with heroics or medals, with 40 gallons of stolen paint and the courage to break rules that needed breaking. Jennifer held the photograph, understanding slowly dawning. The Army never acknowledged this. They couldn't. Acknowledging it meant admitting they'd failed, that a lieutenant had to steal from Germans because American logistics couldn't keep up. Murphy's smile was bitter. So they took his idea, called it doctrine, and pretended it was systematic planning. Your father let them because that's what got the paint to other units faster. He chose saving lives over recognition. Every single time. Jennifer looked at the photograph again, at the white tanks disappearing into winter, at the ghost army her father had created and never claimed credit for. She thought about the quiet man who'd coached her softball team, who'd helped with homework, who'd lived an ordinary life that was only possible because he'd once done something extraordinary. "What should I do with this?" she asked, holding up the photograph. "Remember it," Kowalski said. "Tell your kids. Make sure somebody knows that the system can be beaten when it's wrong, but only if you're willing to pay the price." The photograph ended up in the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, donated by Jennifer in 2003. It's displayed in the Armored Warfare section with a small placard, "Winter Camouflage 3rd Armored Division, 1945. No mention of theft. No explanation of how the innovation actually happened. But veterans who see it know. They recognize the white tanks, remember the winter that changed everything, understand what's not being said in official histories. And sometimes late at night, when the museum is closed, security cameras catch elderly men standing in front of that photograph. Hands trembling, lips moving in silence as they remember friends who came home because someone refused to accept that visibility mattered more than survival. The system buried the truth. But truth has a way of surviving anyway, passed through whispers and photographs and reunions where old men tell younger generations regulations exist to preserve order. But order means nothing if everyone's dead. Sometimes breaking the rules is the most moral thing you can do. Frank Novak stole 40 gallons of enemy paint and made 15 Shermans disappear into snow. The Army called it doctrine. History called it tactical innovation. But the men who lived because of it called it something simpler the moment someone cared more about their survival than his career. And in the end, that's the only truth that mattered. Not the medals, not the manuals, not the sanitized narratives in history books. Just the fact that 63 men made it home to families who never knew how close they'd come to losing them all, because one night in January 1945, someone decided that bureaucracy wasn't worth dying for. If you believe their names deserve to be remembered, not just Novak's, but Kowalski, Murphy, Rosen, Chen, and the 58 others who survived because visibility became irrelevant, share this story. Write their names in the comments below. Because official history might forget, but we don't have to. They built the system to last forever. But sometimes the only way to save it is to break it, repaint it white, and dare anyone to court-martial you for keeping people alive.